The moment my son's lawyer smirked at me across that courtroom, I knew exactly which secret would wipe that smile off his face forever. I stood on the granite steps of Boston's Suffolk County Courthouse, clutching a worn leather portfolio against my chest like a shield. January wind cut through my $80 department store blazer, the one I'd deliberately chosen this morning instead of any of the custom-tailored suits hanging in my closet. Appearances matter in moments like these, and I needed to appear defeated. The courthouse loomed above me, all imposing columns and cold authority. I'd built $1 billion medical technology company from nothing, yet here I was, about to be painted as an incompetent old man clinging to power. At least, that's what they thought. A sleek Maserati purred to the curb, turning heads as it always did. My son Vance emerged first, his tailored Italian suit probably costing more than what most people in this courthouse earned in a month. At 34, he had my height and his mother's striking blue eyes, but none of her compassion. Behind him came Maxwell Reed, his attorney and my former friend of 20 years. Maxwell's silver hair caught the winter sunlight as he leaned close to whisper something in Vance's ear. They both laughed. Before I share this heartbreaking story, please comment below and let me know where my story is reaching you. Your presence means everything as I open these old wounds. My hand trembled slightly as I touched the wedding ring I still wore 15 years after Elise's death. Then, as if sensing my gaze, Vance looked up. Our eyes met across the courthouse plaza. His expression hardened, and he deliberately turned away, Maxwell's hand on his shoulder, guiding him up the steps. They came from my company, my legacy, my life's work. But I'd been planning for this betrayal longer than they could imagine. Corporate betrayals happen every day. Subscribe now before someone blindsides you too. Mr. Blackwood, a court officer approached. They're ready for you inside, sir. I nodded, my shoulders slumping forward. The portfolio felt heavy in my hands, heavier with what it contained than its actual weight. Are you representing yourself today? The officer asked, eyeing my lack of legal entourage. Yes, I said quietly. Just me. His expression flickered with pity. Another old fool who couldn't afford proper representation, about to be devoured by sharks in designer suits. If only he knew. Inside, the courthouse bustled with the controlled chaos of justice being processed. Lawyers in dark suits moved with purpose, clients with anxiety. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished marble wall. Dominic Blackwood, 62. Founder and CEO of Blackwood Medical Technologies, or former CEO, according to the papers Vance had filed. I spent 30 years building an empire. It took me just 30 seconds to make it disappear. The courtroom was already half full when I entered. Boston's business elite had come for the show, the public downfall of Dominic Blackwood. I recognized faces from charity galas and industry conferences now leaning together to whisper as I walked past. In the front row sat Olivia Jenkins, my executive assistant of 15 years. Her presence was the only open act of loyalty anyone had shown me in weeks. She gave me a slight nod, her expression carefully neutral. Vance and Maxwell were already at the plaintiff's table, heads bent over documents. Neither looked up when I took my seat at the defense table. Alone. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs as Judge Camilla Harrington entered. Known for her no-nonsense approach and razor-sharp intelligence, she was exactly who I'd hoped would be assigned to this case. Be seated, she commanded, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the file before her. Blackwood versus Blackwood. A son suing his father for control of a company. Her tone made it clear what she thought of family business being aired in her courtroom. Maxwell rose smoothly. Maxwell Reed for the plaintiff, Your Honor. We've submitted extensive documentation demonstrating Mr. Vance Blackwood's rightful claim to leadership of Blackwood Medical Technologies, based on both his qualifications and the company bylaws regarding succession. Judge Harrington's gaze shifted to me. And you are representing yourself, Mr. Blackwood? Yes, Your Honor. My voice sounded frail even to my own ears. You understand the complexity of corporate law. Mr. Reed is one of Boston's preeminent attorneys in this field. I'm aware of Mr. Reed's incapabilities, Your Honor. I built Blackwood Medical from nothing. I believe I can speak to its future. Maxwell's smile was barely perceptible, but I caught it, the smug satisfaction of a predator who believes his prey is cornered. Beside him, Vance straightened his tie, already imagining himself in the CEO's chair. Very well, Judge Harrington said. Mr. Reed, present your case. For the next 40 minutes, Maxwell laid out a masterful argument. He detailed Vance's Harvard MBA, his successful leadership of our European division, the support of key board members. He presented charts showing stagnating growth under my leadership compared to projected increases under Vance's proposed initiatives. He cited company bylaws that favored family succession and medical evaluations suggesting my decision-making had become increasingly erratic following a minor stroke last year. A stroke I'd kept private until Vance somehow obtained my medical records. Throughout it all, I remained silent, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. I could feel the courtroom's collective judgment. Another aging founder unable to let go, another family destroyed by pride and power. And furthermore, he continued, his voice resonating with practiced conviction, Mr. Blackwood Sr. has repeatedly rejected reasonable buyout offers and transition plans. His emotional attachment to the company is preventing necessary growth and endangering the livelihoods of over 3,000 employees. I glanced at Vance. He was watching me, not with triumph, but with something closer to pity. That was perhaps the most painful part. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He thought he was saving the company from me, not realizing he was being manipulated by the man beside him. Your Honor, Maxwell concluded, we ask the court to enforce the succession provisions of the company bylaws and grant Mr. Vance Blackwood immediate control of Blackwood Medical Technologies, with appropriate compensation to the defendant for his shares to be determined by independent valuation. Judge Harrington nodded. Thank you, Mr. Reed. She turned to me. Mr. Blackwood, your response. I slowly rose to my feet, the leather portfolio still closed before me. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. What defense could this lone old man possibly mount against such a comprehensive attack? Your Honor, I began, my voice stronger now, I have only one document to present to the court. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. Vance frowned slightly, sensing something in my tone. What they didn't know about that leather portfolio would destroy them both. But first, I needed them to believe they'd already won. Before I present this document, I said, I'd like to ask my son one question. I turned to face Vance directly. When did you last speak with your mother's sister, Cassandra? The question caught him off guard. What does Aunt Cass have to do with anything? Everything, I said quietly. She called me last week. She was concerned about some documents you asked her to sign regarding your children's trust fund. Maxwell's hand moved slightly as if to signal Vance to stay quiet, but it was too late. That's a private family matter, Vance said stiffly. Is it? I opened the portfolio at last. Just like the company you're suing for control of is a family matter? I removed a single document and handed it to the court officer, who delivered it to Judge Harrington. Your Honor, I said, I believe this renders today's proceedings moot. As the judge read the document, her eyebrows rose fractionally, the only break in her professional composure. Mr. Reed, she said after a moment, are you aware of this filing? Maxwell frowned. May I approach, Your Honor? As he read over the judge's shoulder, I watched the blood drain from his face. For the first time in 20 years of knowing Maxwell Reed, I saw genuine shock break through his carefully maintained facade. This appears to be in order, Judge Harrington said. Mr. Blackwood, would you care to explain to the court what you've submitted? I nodded, finally allowing myself to stand straight, shoulders back. 3 years ago, I sold Blackwood Medical Technologies to Westlake Healthcare Partners. I no longer own the company my son is suing me for control of. The courtroom erupted.
I thought burying my wife was the worst day of my life. Then my son said 7 words that changed everything. I'm taking what should have always been mine. The memory of those words echoed in my mind as I knelt at Elisa's grave, the January wind cutting through my coat like it was made of paper. 15 years gone, and still the pain felt fresh. I placed gardenias, her favorite, against the cold marble, their sweet scent a jarring contrast to the sterile winter air. My knees ached against the frozen ground, but I welcomed the physical pain. It was simpler than the other kind. I miss you, I whispered, tracing the engraved letters of her name. He needs you. I failed him, Elise. The cemetery was empty, except for an elderly groundskeeper in the distance, methodically clearing fallen branches from recent storms. 15 years ago, this place had been packed with mourners. Boston's elite, coming to pay respects to Elise Blackwood, beloved philanthropist and the heart of Blackwood Medical. The company had been barely 10 years old then, just beginning to make its mark in medical technology. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was back on that rainy night. The screeching tires on rain-slicked roads, the phone call that shattered my world while I sat in a boardroom finalizing our first major acquisition. By the time I reached the hospital, it was too late. Vance had been 14, gangly and furious with grief. I still remember him standing in the hospital corridor, his face contorted with rage and pain. "You killed her," he'd screamed, his adolescent voice cracking. "Your precious company was more important than picking her up. She wouldn't have been on that road if it wasn't for you." My hands had shaken as I signed the hospital paperwork, as I made funeral arrangements, as I tried to comfort a son who wouldn't let me near him. I threw myself into the company after that, the one thing I still knew how to do. I told myself I was securing Vance's future, building a legacy for him. I never realized I was losing him in the process. "Mr. Blackwood," a soft voice pulled me from the memory. I turned to see Dr. Naomi Chen standing a respectful distance away, her dark coat buttoned against the cold. "I thought I might find you here." I rose slowly, my joints protesting. "Naomi, I didn't expect to see you today." She approached, placing her own small bouquet beside mine. She'd been a young researcher when Elise was alive, one of the first people we'd hired. Now she headed our R&D division, or had until recently. "I wanted to pay my respects," she said simply, "and to see how you're doing after yesterday's board meeting." The board meeting. My jaw tightened at the memory. 3 days ago, I'd walked into our main conference room expecting a routine quarterly review. Instead, I found Vance standing at the head of the table, my place. The board members sat around him, their expressions carefully neutral, all except Maxwell Reed, who watched me with barely concealed satisfaction. "Dad," Vance had said, not moving from his position, "we need to talk about the future of Blackwood Medical. I took a seat, aware of every eye in the room. I wasn't aware the future was in question. Vance had straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd had from college. My father built this company with outdated values and obsolete vision, he announced to the room, as if I weren't there. While our competitors are advancing into artificial intelligence and predictive diagnostics, we're still focused on incremental improvements to existing technologies. The board members' eyes shifted away from me, all except Dr. Chen, who held my gaze steadily. The quarterly numbers speak for themselves, I'd countered. Our approach is profitable and sustainable. Sustainable isn't enough anymore, Vance had replied. We need to be revolutionary. Maxwell had placed his hand on Vance's shoulder then, a gesture of support that felt like a knife between my ribs. The future of Blackwood Medical requires new leadership, he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. What happened next shocked everyone in that room, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, standing in the cemetery with Naomi, I asked the question that had been burning in me. How long have you known what they were planning? She sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. Rumors started about 6 months ago. Vance has been meeting privately with board members, making promises. Maxwell has been there every step of the way. And you didn't tell me? Would you have believed me? Her gaze was direct, challenging. You've always had a blind spot where Vance is concerned. She was right, of course. I'd made excuses for him for years. His arrogance, his entitlement, his increasingly ruthless business tactics. I'd told myself it was ambition, that he'd mature with time. I'd been wrong. The following day, security had escorted me from my own research lab, my keycard deactivated. The head of security, a man I'd hired personally, couldn't meet my eyes as he explained that my access was temporarily restricted pending legal action. You have 30 days to respond to the legal action, Mr. Blackwood. He handed me a thick envelope bearing Maxwell's firm's logo. I stood in the lobby of the building that bore my name, clutching the envelope as employees I'd known for years hurried past, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the floor tiles. Only Olivia had approached, her expression a mixture of outrage and concern.
"This is insane," she'd whispered. "They can't just lock you out." "Apparently they can," I'd replied, trying to maintain my dignity. For now. Later, in my home office, I'd opened the envelope. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. Vance was suing for control of Blackwood Medical, citing the company bylaws regarding family succession and questioning my mental competence following my minor stroke. What had cut deepest was discovering that Maxwell had been secretly advising Vance for 18 months. Maxwell, who'd been my attorney for 2 decades, who'd stood beside me as we built the company, who'd been a pallbearer at Elise's funeral. The company bylaws clearly favor family succession, Maxwell had explained with practiced sympathy when I confronted him by phone. Vance is simply exercising his rights as your son and heir. "And what about your duty to me as my attorney?" I'd asked. "I recused myself from representing you 6 months ago. The notification was sent to your office. It's not my fault if you didn't read it." I checked with Olivia later. The notification had been buried in a routine contract renewal, a single paragraph on page 16 that mentioned Maxwell's firm would no longer handle my personal legal matters due to potential conflicts of interest. Nothing about him representing my son against me. My home office had felt like a mausoleum that night, the family photos on the walls now feeling like accusations. What did I miss? When had my son's ambition turned to betrayal? When had Maxwell decided I was dispensable? Olivia had stayed late, helping me organize my personal files, separate from the company documents. "We've all seen what you sacrificed for this company. For Vance," she'd said quietly, her loyalty one of the few things I could still count on. I'd looked at her then, this woman who'd managed my professional life for 15 years, who knew more about Blackwood Medical's inner workings than anyone except me. "Some debts can only be paid in full," I'd replied. Now standing in the cemetery with Naomi, I felt a resolve hardening within me. They think they've won already. Haven't they? The board vote is scheduled for next week. Maxwell has been thorough. I smiled for the first time in days. Maxwell has always had one blind spot. He underestimates anyone who isn't him. Naomi studied my face. "You have a plan." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I've had a plan since the day Vance joined the company. I just hoped I'd never need to use it." "Whatever you're thinking, be careful," she warned. "Maxwell doesn't play fair." "Neither do I," I said, touching Elise's headstone one last time. As we walked back toward the cemetery gates, Naomi hesitated. "There's something else you should know. The new diagnostic algorithm Vance has been promoting to the board, it's not his work. He took Dr. Patterson's research and presented it as his own." I stopped. "Can you prove that?" She nodded. Dr. Patterson kept his original notes, dated and witnessed. Another piece clicked into place. "Thank you, Naomi, for everything." "What are you going to do?" I looked back at Elise's grave, a solitary island of marble in the winter landscape. What I should have done years ago. That evening, I sat in my home office surrounded by the evidence of my life's work. Awards on the walls, prototypes of our first devices in glass cases, photos of hospital openings and charity galas. And everywhere, pictures of Vance, graduating high school, college, his MBA ceremony at Harvard. The son I'd raised alone. The son who now wanted everything I'd built. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Olivia. Subject line, trust fund documentation. I thought burying my wife was the worst day of my life. Then my son said 7 words that changed everything. I'm taking what should have always been mine. Some say revenge is justified when family betrays you. Others call it unforgivable. What do you think? But what if I'd already made sure there was nothing left to take? Only subscribers see the warning signs. Don't miss out.
That night, something broke inside me. Or maybe something finally healed. I found Elise's journal by accident. 15 years after her death, I was finally clearing out the last of her things from the guest room closet, a task I'd postponed for far too long. The leather-bound book had slipped from between 2 sweaters, landing with a soft thud on the hardwood floor. I recognized it immediately. Elise had written in it almost daily, a habit I had always respected by never reading its contents. My hands trembled as I picked it up, her handwriting bringing her voice back with such clarity that for a moment I could almost hear her in the room with me. I sat on the edge of the bed, turning pages slowly, moving through the years of our life together. And then I found the entry from 2 months before her death. "I worry about Vance," she'd written. "He has Dominic's intelligence and my determination, but there's something else there, a hardness I don't recognize from either of us. I fear success will poison our son if it comes too easily. He needs to understand that value comes from creation, not acquisition, from giving, not taking. How do we teach him that when everything has always been provided?" The journal fell open to a page with a pressed gardenia, our wedding flower. The delicate, dried petals crumbled slightly at my touch, fragile with age, just like the illusions I'd maintained about my son. I stood before the window of my study, Elise's journal clutched in my hand, and watched my reflection transform. The grief that had been my constant companion for 15 years didn't disappear, but it shifted, making room for something colder and more focused. In the darkened glass, I saw my expression harden from sorrow to resolve. That night, I made a phone call I'd been putting off for years. We've all faced moments when we must sacrifice what we built to protect what matters most. Revenge requires perfect timing. Subscribe now or miss the warning signs in your life. Not convinced? Comment why and tell me what's holding you back. Abigail Torres, answered the crisp voice on the other end. Abigail, it's Dominic Blackwood. A pause. Dominic, it's been, 3 years since you turned down our offer? Things have changed, I said simply. I'd like to meet. Tonight, if possible. Another pause. My office, 1 hour. Westlake Healthcare Partners occupied the top floor of a gleaming tower in downtown Boston, its windows still blazing with light well past midnight. Abigail Torres, CEO and majority owner, met me at the elevator. At 58, she radiated the confident energy of someone who had built her empire through sheer force of will and intelligence. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting. "It's been a difficult week." Her office offered a panoramic view of Boston Harbor, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. She poured 2 fingers of scotch into crystal tumblers and handed one to me. "So," she said, settling behind her desk, "your son is making a play for your company." News traveled fast in our industry. "You've heard. Maxwell Reed has been dropping hints for months that Blackwood Medical might soon be under new management." She studied me over the rim of her glass. "I always wondered why you never groomed Vance as your successor." "I did," I replied, "just not in the way he expected." She raised an eyebrow. "Explain." I placed a USB drive on her desk. "Everything you need to know about Blackwood Medical's current research pipeline, financial projections for the next 5 years, and detailed analysis of our market position." "And why would you give me this?" "Because I want to reopen our discussion from 3 years ago, with some modifications." For the next 2 hours, we negotiated. The scratch of my Mont Blanc pen signing documents at 2:37 a.m. felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. When we finished, Abigail leaned back in her chair. "You realize what this means. Once the announcement goes public next month, there's no going back." "I'm counting on it." She shook her head slightly. "I never thought you'd sell, especially not to us." "I'm not selling," I corrected her. "I'm ensuring my legacy." The next morning, I met with Dr. Chen in a coffee shop 3 blocks from Blackwood Medical's headquarters. Her eyes widened as I explained what I'd done. "Once you do this, Vance will never forgive you," she warned. I stirred my untouched coffee. "Forgiveness isn't part of my estate plan." "What about the foundation? Will that continue?" "That's the one thing that won't change. In fact, it's about to become much more significant." What was in those documents I signed with Abigail Torres? The answer would stun everyone, especially Vance and Maxwell. For the next week, I maintained a low profile. I avoided calls from board members and declined interview requests from business publications speculating about the family drama at Blackwood Medical. Instead, I focused on the second phase of my plan. From the window of my favorite restaurant, I watched Vance and Maxwell at their regular table inside, plotting over expensive scotch. They met here every Thursday, I'd learned from Olivia, who had become my eyes and ears inside the company. They thought I was broken, defeated. That's the power of being underestimated. Back at home, I spent hours methodically transferring digital assets to an unnamed foundation. Every patent I'd developed independently, every research grant I'd personally funded, every piece of intellectual property that wasn't explicitly tied to Blackwood Medical, but had been licensed to the company through my personal holding entities. "They're going to fight this," Olivia said, watching me work. She had taken to coming to my home after hours, helping me prepare. "Let them," I replied. "The paperwork is ironclad." "What about the board meeting tomorrow? They're expecting you to fight the vote." I smiled. "And disappoint them? Never." The Blackwood Medical boardroom fell silent when I entered the next morning. 14 pairs of eyes watched me take my seat, not at the head of the table, but along the side, like any other member. Vance sat in my usual chair, Maxwell standing behind him like a consigliere. "Thank you all for coming," Vance began, his confidence evident in every syllable. "As you know, we're here to vote on the leadership transition proposal that was distributed last week. Before we begin, I want to assure everyone that this change is in the best interests of the company, our shareholders, and our patients." I said nothing, merely nodding slightly when a few board members glanced my way, looking for some reaction. "Dad," Vance said, addressing me directly for the first time, "would you like to say anything before we proceed?" "Every betrayal has its price. Theirs would cost exactly everything. I just want to thank each of you for your service to Blackwood Medical. Whatever happens today, I hope you'll continue to uphold the principles on which this company was founded." Maxwell frowned slightly, clearly expecting more resistance. Vance looked momentarily uncertain before regaining his composure. "Let's move to the vote," he said. One by one, the board members voiced their decisions. As expected, the vote was 10-4 in favor of Vance assuming the role of CEO of Blackwood Medical, with me retaining a position as non-executive chairman, a ceremonial role with no actual power. "Motion carried," Vance announced, unable to keep the triumph from his voice. "Effective immediately, I will assume the role of Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Medical Technologies." I stood and offered my hand. "Congratulations, son." The confusion on his face was worth every moment of humiliation I'd endured. He had expected a fight, recriminations, perhaps even tears. My calm acceptance threw him completely off balance. As the meeting adjourned, Maxwell cornered me by the door. "That was surprisingly gracious, Dominic." "We all have to accept change, Maxwell, even you." His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll find out soon enough." Later that afternoon, I met with my personal attorney, not from Maxwell's firm, to update my will with cryptic instructions about the trust fund I'd established years ago for Vance's children, my grandchildren, though Vance rarely allowed me to see them. Olivia organized the documents, her expression troubled. "This will destroy him, you know." I paused, considering her words. "Or save him. Depends which part of him survives." She glanced down at the foundation paperwork on my desk, the name partially visible beneath other documents. Elise Legacy Foundation. Some call this revenge, others call it justice. What do you think? That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Chen arrived at my door, her expression grave. "I had to come in person," she said, declining my offer of tea. "I've been going through the company files, trying to understand some discrepancies in the research budget." "And?" She found something disturbing. She placed a folder on my coffee table. Financial transfers from the company to a series of offshore accounts. They started small about 18 months ago, but they've been increasing. I opened the folder, scanning the documents. Around the time Maxwell began advising Vance. She nodded. "There's more. I found emails between Maxwell and the board members who supported Vance. He's been promising them significant returns on certain strategic investments once Vance takes control. Can you prove any of this is illegal?" "Not yet, but it's highly unethical at minimum." I closed the folder. "Thank you, Naomi. This helps more than you know." After she left, I stood in my study, looking at the photographs that chronicled my life. Elise and me on our wedding day, Vance's birth, the ribbon cutting at Blackwood Medical's first facility, family vacations, award ceremonies, moments that had seemed so important at the time, now revealed as merely prologue to this final act.
Everything was set for the courtroom shout-down. Then I discovered the truth. Maxwell hadn't just advised my son. He'd been systematically poisoning Vance against me since the day we buried his mother. A text message from Olivia interrupted my thoughts. Found something. Need to meet tomorrow, early. I replied with a simple yes, then turned off my phone. In the silence of my home, I made peace with what was to come. Patient revenge or immediate justice. Which hits harder? I was about to find out.
Have you ever watched someone you love being manipulated? The helplessness burns like nothing else. I met Olivia at a small cafe 3 blocks from her apartment at 6:30 a.m. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept. "I was up all night going through these," she said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "Maxwell's been busy. Tell me." She leaned forward, keeping her voice low despite the nearly empty cafe. "I accessed his calendar through the company server. 15 years ago, Maxwell was up for partnership at Reed, Hollingsworth, and Klein. The managing partners were split on his promotion. I remember. I was asked for my opinion as a major client." Her eyes widened slightly. "You're the reason he didn't make partner?" I expressed concerns about some accounting irregularities I'd noticed in our billing. Nothing I could prove, but enough to raise questions. "That explains a lot." She tapped the drive. "He's been meeting with Vance since before Elise's funeral. Not as his attorney, as a family friend offering support. The earliest email I found was from 3 days after she died." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined. While I'd been planning my wife's funeral, Maxwell had already been positioning himself with my grieving son. "There's more," Olivia continued. "I found offshore accounts growing suspiciously after each of Vance's business decisions. Every time Vance directed company resources toward a new project or partnership, money appeared in these accounts." "Can we trace them to Maxwell?" "Not directly. They're registered to shell companies in the Caymans, but the timing is too perfect to be coincidence." I sipped my coffee, processing this information. "What about the Children's Trust Fund?" Her expression darkened. "The trust fund for Vance's kids, your grandchildren, it's gone. Liquidated last year for what the paperwork calls strategic acquisitions. Maxwell's signature is on the authorization as trustee." "And Vance?" "His signature is there too, but I'm not sure he understood what he was signing. The documents were buried in a stack of routine approvals." The cafe was filling with morning commuters. I lowered my voice further. "Does Vance know you're helping me?" She shook her head. "He thinks I'm just doing my job, transitioning files to his new assistant. I've been careful." "Be more careful. Maxwell is dangerous when cornered. I can handle myself." She glanced at her watch. "I should go. I have a meeting with the new executive team at 8. As she stood to leave, I caught her arm. "Olivia, thank you." She gave me a tired smile. Some of us still remember what Blackwood Medical is supposed to stand for. After she left, I remained at the cafe, watching Boston wake up around me. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture more disturbing than I'd imagined. Maxwell hadn't just opportunistically sided with my son. He'd been orchestrating this coup for years, using Vance as his puppet, while systematically draining resources for himself. That afternoon, I drove to a part of Boston I rarely visited, the modest suburban neighborhood where Elise's sister, Cassandra, lived. Unlike Elise, who had embraced the social obligations that came with our success, Cassandra had always maintained a deliberate distance from wealth and its trappings. She answered the door in gardening clothes. Her resemblance to Elise was still striking enough to make my heart skip. "Dominic, this is unexpected." "I need your help, Cass." Her living room was cluttered with books and plants, photos of her niece and nephew, Vance's children, prominently displayed. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation, her expression growing increasingly troubled. I always thought Maxwell was too smooth by half. But this? Using Vance against you all these years? When this breaks, he'll need someone who isn't me. Someone he trusts, who isn't connected to the company or the money. She nodded slowly. You want me to be there for him when it all falls apart. And for the children. They shouldn't suffer for their father's mistakes. Or your grandfather's revenge, she added pointedly. I didn't deny it. Will you help? I'll help Vance and the kids, not your vendetta. It was enough. As I was leaving, she called after me. Elise would hate this, you know. The two people she loved most trying to destroy each other. Elise isn't here, I replied. That's part of the problem. The next morning, I was sorting through old files in my home office when the security system alerted me to someone at the front gate. Wait, what you're about to see changes everything. The camera showed Vance's Tesla pulling up the driveway. I met him at the door, noting the dark circles under his eyes that matched Olivia's. The strain of his new role was already showing. Dad, we need to talk. I led him to my study, the room where I'd once helped him with homework, where I'd taught him to tie a tie before his first formal dance. Now we faced each other like strangers. I found these in your trash, he said, pulling crumpled meeting notes from his pocket. The Wakeleek Healthcare Partners logo was clearly visible at the top. Whatever you're planning won't work. Maxwell's already thought of everything. And what does Maxwell think I'm planning? A hostile takeover attempt, using Wakeleek as your proxy. His voice was accusatory. You'd rather see the company in the hands of competitors than your own son. The irony was almost painful. Is that what he told you? It's obvious. These meeting notes are from 3 years ago. When Wakeleek first approached me about an acquisition, I turned them down. Doubt flickered across his face. Then why meet with them now? Who says I have? You were seen entering Abigail Torres's building last week. So they were having me followed. Interesting. Abigail and I serve on the Children's Hospital Board together. It was a charity matter. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, but he couldn't prove otherwise. I decided to change tactics. Vance, when was the last time you looked at the trust fund statements for your children? His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. What does that have to do with anything? Humor me? I don't know. Maxwell handles all that. He sends me quarterly summaries. And what did the last summary show? Growth. Good returns. He's growing impatient. Dad, what's your point? My point is that you should ask to see the actual accounts, not just Maxwell's summaries. Anger flashed in his eyes. This is exactly what Maxwell warned me about, you trying to drive a wedge between us because you can't stand losing control. I sighed, suddenly feeling every one of my 62 years. You're right. I can't fight both of you. The admission seemed to catch him off guard. His anger deflated slightly, replaced by weariness. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time we discussed settlement terms before the court date. Vance's premature victory was evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I'll have Maxwell drop the paperwork. No, not Maxwell. I'll have my own attorney handle it. He hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but no delays. We file the settlement before the hearing next week.
After he left, I stood at my study window, watching his car disappear down the driveway. Comment trap if you see what I'm really doing here.
Family betrayals destroy lives daily. Subscribe now for protection strategies they don't want you to know. That evening, I found myself studying Vance's Harvard graduation photo, tracing my son's face with my fingertip. He'd been so proud that day, so full of promise. When had that ambitious young man turned into someone who could conspire with Maxwell against his own father? Had I driven him to this with my own neglect, my own obsession with the company? I built an empire of healing while my own family was sick. We both have blood on our hands. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Olivia, her voice tight with tension. "Maxwell cornered me in the parking garage," she said, without preamble. "He knows I've been helping you." My grip tightened on the phone. "Are you all right?" "Yes, but he was intimidating. Said I should stay out of family business unless you want to lose more than just your job." "What did you say?" I could hear the smile in her voice despite the stress. "I told him some families deserve to be broken. Brave, but dangerous. Where are you now?" "Home. Don't worry, I'm not alone. My brother's staying with me." "Good. And the documents we discussed?" "Safe. I made copies before Maxwell confronted me." After we hung up, I called my security company and arranged for discreet protection for Olivia. Maxwell was growing desperate, which made him unpredictable. The next 60 seconds will change everything you thought you knew about this case. 2 days later, I received the settlement papers from Vance's new attorney. Not Maxwell, interestingly enough. I reviewed them carefully, noting the generous terms. I would retain 15% of my shares, a seat on the board, and the title of Founder Emeritus. In exchange, I would publicly support Vance's leadership and drop any potential legal challenges. The settlement papers were ready for signatures until I noticed what Maxwell had hidden on page 16 in 8-point font. A clause requiring me to dissolve the Elise Legacy Foundation and transfer all its assets to Blackwood Medical's general fund, which Vance now controlled. I called Vance immediately. "Did you read the settlement agreement before it was sent?" "Of course," though his tone suggested otherwise. "Including the clause about dissolving Mom's foundation?" A pause. "What foundation?" "The Elise Legacy Foundation, the one I established after her death to fund research into the rare condition that killed her." Another, longer pause. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then I suggest you ask Maxwell why he included a clause to dissolve a foundation you claim to know nothing about." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately called Olivia. "I need you to secure those documents tonight. Maxwell's making his move." "I'll get them now," she promised. An hour later, she texted, "Done. Everything's copied. Meeting you tomorrow as planned." But Olivia never met our meeting. At 2:17 a.m., my phone rang. "Someone broke into my apartment," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm okay. My brother scared them off. But they took my laptop." "The documents?" "Safe. I had them on a drive in my gym bag. But Dominic, they knew exactly when to come, when my brother stepped out for a cigarette. They had a key. It had to be Maxwell. Or someone he hired. Either way, they're getting desperate. Stay somewhere else tonight. Don't tell me where. Just go." After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my study, contemplating how far Maxwell was willing to go. Breaking and entering, intimidation, what would be next? The following morning brought my answer. Security camera footage from my home system showed Vance entering my property at 3:42 a.m., using the gate code he'd known since childhood.
He moved with purpose toward the house, something clutched in his hand. I was prepared for court tomorrow, until the security camera showed Vance entering my house with something clutched in his hand. The footage showed him using his key to enter, then moving directly to my study. He stood before the family photos for a long moment, then placed what he was carrying on my desk. A small, gift-wrapped package. He left without taking anything. When I reviewed the footage and entered my study, I found the package still there. Inside was a framed photo I'd never seen before. Elise holding infant Vance in the hospital, her expression radiant with new motherhood. A note was attached in Vance's handwriting. I found this in Aunt Cass's albums. Thought you should have it. Is Vance a villain or a victim? The truth might be neither. That afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Chen. Maxwell's been asking questions about the research budget allocations from last year, specifically the projects you personally approved. What did you tell him? Nothing yet, but he's scheduled a full audit for tomorrow morning. Let him look, I said. He won't find what he's searching for. And what's that? The truth. As night fell, I made my final preparations for court. The leather portfolio contained everything I needed: the documentation of the sale to Westlake, the evidence of Maxwell's manipulation, the trust fund records. One last piece remained. I opened my safe and removed a sealed envelope Elise had given me years ago, with instructions to open it only if Vance ever turned against me. Inside was a letter in her handwriting, addressed to our son. I added it to the portfolio. The most dangerous betrayals come disguised as protection. Maxwell had protected Vance from me for 15 years, while systematically undermining everything Elise and I had built. Tomorrow, that protection would be exposed for what it truly was: the longest con of all.
The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, Boston's skyline crisp against the winter sky. I dressed with deliberate care: charcoal suit, white shirt, the blue tie Elise had given me on our last anniversary. Not the power suit most would expect, but something more personal. This wasn't just business anymore. What happened in that courtroom would shock Boston's elite for years to come. The truth was darker than anyone expected. Judge Camilla Harrington's courtroom was already packed when I arrived. Financial reporters, industry analysts, and curious spectators filled the gallery. Blackwood Medical Technologies represented one of Boston's largest employers. Its potential dismantling was newsworthy. I spotted Vance immediately, seated beside Maxwell at the plaintiff's table. My son looked exhausted, the strain of recent weeks evident in the tightness around his eyes. Maxwell, by contrast, appeared triumphant, leaning over to whisper something that made Vance nod mechanically. My attorney, Patricia Winters, met me at the defense table. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. "I've been ready for 3 years," I replied, placing my leather portfolio on the table. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harrington entered. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and razor-sharp intelligence, exactly why I'd requested her for this case when filing my countersuit months ago. "Before we begin," she said after the preliminaries, "I understand there were settlement discussions. Have those been fruitful?" Maxwell stood. "Your Honor, we believed we were close to an agreement, but Mr. Blackwood has been uncooperative." "Is that so?" Judge Harrington turned to me. "Mr. Blackwood, do you wish to respond?" I rose slowly. "Your Honor, I rejected the settlement because it contained hidden provisions designed to dismantle my late wife's medical research foundation, a provision my son claims he knew nothing about." Vance's head snapped toward Maxwell, confusion evident on his face.
Furthermore, I continued, I've filed a countersuit this morning against Maxwell Reed for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and conspiracy to commit corporate theft. The courtroom erupted. Maxwell was on his feet, face flushed with anger. This is outrageous! A desperate attempt to... Enough, Judge Harrington cut him off. Mr. Blackwood, these are serious allegations against counsel of record. Do you have evidence to support them? I do, Your Honor, and I believe my son should hear it first. The judge studied me for a moment, then nodded. Proceed. I turned to face Vance directly. 15 years ago, Maxwell Reed was denied partnership at his law firm. He blamed me for it because I raised concerns about billing irregularities. That same year, he approached you, offering friendship and mentorship, not because he cared about you, but because he saw an opportunity for revenge. Maxwell's voice cut through the courtroom. Objection! This is slander! You'll have your turn, Mr. Reed, Judge Harrington said. Continue, Mr. Blackwood. I removed a stack of documents from my portfolio. These are records of offshore accounts that grew suspiciously after each of Vance's business decisions. Every time my son directed company resources toward a new project, money appeared in these accounts. I handed the documents to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. The accounts are registered to shell companies, but the beneficial owner is Maxwell Reed. Maxwell's face had gone from red to white. Your Honor, I don't know where he got those documents, but they're fabricated. They came from your own computer, Maxwell. Olivia Jenkins recovered them before you had the chance to delete everything. At the mention of Olivia's name, Maxwell's composure cracked. His eyes darted around the courtroom, perhaps looking for her. She's not here, I said. After your hired thugs broke into her apartment, she thought it prudent to secure the evidence elsewhere. Judge Camilla Harrington was reviewing the documents, her expression growing increasingly severe. Mr. Reed, these appear to be authentic banking records. Care to explain? Maxwell straightened his tie, visibly struggling to regain control. Your Honor, these are personal investments, completely unrelated to Blackwood Medical. Mr. Blackwood is attempting to distract from the real issue, his refusal to accept his son's rightful leadership. I turned back to Vance. Do you know what happened to your children's trust fund, the one I established when they were born? Confusion flickered across his face. It's being managed by Maxwell. It's gone, I said flatly. Liquidated last year for what the paperwork calls strategic acquisitions. Your signature is on the authorization, but I suspect you didn't know what you were signing. Vance turned to Maxwell, the first hint of doubt in his eyes. Is that true? He leaned close, whispering urgently. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the pattern, the same soothing, manipulative tone he'd been using on my son for 15 years. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that Maxwell Reed has been systematically poisoning my relationship with my son since my wife's death, with the ultimate goal of gaining control of Blackwood Medical Technologies. Objection! Maxwell was on his feet again. This is a corporate governance case, not a family therapy session. Judge Harrington's gaze was cold. Mr. Reed, given the nature of the allegations against you, I'm inclined to hear Mr. Blackwood out. She turned to me. Continue, but brief. I nodded, then addressed the courtroom at large. 3 years ago, I discovered that Maxwell had been manipulating my son against me, and I also learned that he had been skimming from the company through various schemes, including the Children's Trust Fund. Rather than confront him immediately, I decided to set a trap. The courtroom was utterly silent now, every person leaning slightly forward. I sold Blackwood Medical Technologies to Westlake Healthcare Partners 3 years ago. The silence shattered. Reporters scrambled for their phones, spectators gasped, and Maxwell leapt to his feet. That's impossible! The company is publicly traded. There would have been SEC filings, shareholder votes. Not if the sale was structured as a forward contract, I replied calmly. The agreement gave Westlake the right to purchase the company at a predetermined price, contingent on certain conditions. One of those conditions was the resolution of this lawsuit. I turned back to Vance, whose face had gone ashen. "You're not fighting me for control of the company, son. You're fighting Abigail Torres, CEO of Westlake Healthcare. She's the real owner for 3 years." "You're lying," Vance whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. I removed the final document from my portfolio and handed it to the clerk. "This is the purchase agreement, signed by myself and Ms. Torres, and witnessed by 2 members of the Blackwood board who were sworn to secrecy." As the judge reviewed the document, I continued. "The day after I signed this agreement, I began transferring my personal assets into the Elise Legacy Foundation, the foundation Maxwell tried to dissolve in the settlement offer. That foundation now controls 51% of my original shares in the company." Maxwell was frantically whispering to Vance, who had gone completely still, staring at me with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "Your Honor, I would like to call Abigail Torres to the stand." The courtroom doors opened, and Abigail entered, immaculate in a tailored navy suit. She walked confidently to the witness stand and was sworn in.
"Miss Torres," I began, "could you please confirm for the court the nature of our agreement regarding Blackwood Medical Technologies?" "Certainly," she replied. 3 years ago, Dominic Blackwood and I signed a forward purchase agreement for Blackwood Medical Technologies. The agreement included a 3-year operating period during which Mr. Blackwood would remain as CEO while we prepared for integration. The purchase becomes final upon resolution of this lawsuit. And the purchase price? $12 billion plus performance incentives. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. It was nearly double the company's current market valuation. "Thank you, Miss Torres." I turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to submit one final piece of evidence." I withdrew the sealed envelope from my portfolio, Elise's letter to Vance. "This is a letter from my late wife to our son. She asked me to give it to him only if he ever turned against me." I walked to the plaintiff's table and placed the envelope in front of Vance. "Whatever happens today, this belongs to you." Returning to my place, I addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I am not contesting my son's lawsuit. I freely admit that I concealed the sale of the company from him and from Maxwell Reed. I did so because I needed to expose the extent of Maxwell's manipulation and theft." Judge Harrington studied me for a long moment. "Mr. Blackwood, while I appreciate your candor, concealing a major corporate transaction from shareholders and the board could constitute securities fraud." "It would," I agreed, "if I hadn't followed SEC regulations for forward contracts to the letter. The transaction was properly reported, just not publicly disclosed, as is permitted under Section 13-D for certain types of acquisitions." The judge turned to Maxwell. "Mr. Reed, these allegations against you are extremely serious. Do you wish to respond?" Maxwell had regained some of his composure. "Your Honor, this is clearly a vindictive attempt by Mr. Blackwood to maintain control through subterfuge. I categorically deny any wrongdoing and request time to prepare a proper response to these baseless accusations." "You will have that opportunity," Judge Harrington replied. "But given the evidence presented, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal investigation." She turned to Vance. "Mr. Blackwood, as the plaintiff, do you wish to proceed with your case in light of this new information?" Vance sat motionless, his hand resting on his mother's unopened letter. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I request a recess, Your Honor. I need time to process this." "Granted," she replied.
This court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. She banged her gavel, and the courtroom erupted into chaos. As security officers escorted Maxwell out, the judge had ordered him to surrender his passport. I watched Vance slip his mother's letter into his pocket and walk quickly from the courtroom, ignoring the reporters shouting questions. Abigail approached me as I gathered my documents. "That was quite a performance," she said quietly. "Not a performance, just the truth, finally." "What happens now?" I closed my portfolio. Now we wait for Vance to read his mother's letter. That evening, as darkness fell over Boston, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Vance standing on the threshold, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, and he entered the house he'd grown up in, moving automatically towards my study. I followed, watching as he took in the familiar surroundings, the bookshelves, the family photos, the view of the garden Elise had loved. "I read Mom's letter," he said finally. I nodded, but said nothing. She knew, didn't she? Even back then, she knew something wasn't right with Maxwell. "Your mother was an excellent judge of character," I replied. "What else did she say?" Vance's hand went to his pocket, where the letter presumably rested. "She asked me to give it to you only if he ever turned against me." She was right. "I should have told you about Maxwell years ago," I admitted. "I thought I could handle it alone, spare you the knowledge of his betrayal. And I should have questioned why he was so determined to drive us apart. The trust fund, my children's money, is it really gone?" I sat across from him. "Not entirely. When I suspected what Maxwell was doing, I established a new trust with Westlake Healthcare as trustee. It contains twice what the original fund held." Relief washed over his face, followed quickly by shame. "I don't deserve your help." "You're my son," I said simply. "That hasn't changed." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 15 years of misunderstanding between us. "What happens to the company now?" he finally asked. "It depends partly on you. Abigail wants to keep the Blackwood name and legacy. She's offered you a position as head of research and development, your true passion, before Maxwell convinced you that you needed to be CEO. Surprise flickered across his face. "And you? Will you stay?" I shook my head. "My time is done. The Elise Legacy Foundation will keep me busy enough." "The foundation Maxwell tried to dissolve," Vance said bitterly. "I swear I didn't know about that clause in the settlement." "I believe you." Another silence fell, more comfortable than the last. "Dad," Vance said finally, "I'm sorry for everything." "I know." I met his gaze steadily. "So am I." He nodded, understanding passing between us. Not forgiveness, not yet. That would take time. But acknowledgement. A beginning. The next morning, we walked into the courtroom together. The gallery fell silent at the sight of us presenting a united front for the first time in years. Judge Harrington called the court to order. "Mr. Blackwood," she addressed Vance, "have you reached a decision regarding your lawsuit?" Vance stood. "I have, Your Honor. I'm withdrawing my complaint and supporting my father's countersuit against Maxwell Reed." The judge nodded. "Very well. And Mr. Blackwood," she turned to me, "regarding the sale of the company." I rose. "The transaction will proceed as planned, Your Honor. Westlake Healthcare Partners will assume control of Blackwood Medical Technologies, with my son joining their executive team as head of research and development. And the Elise Legacy Foundation will remain independent, dedicated to researching the condition that took my wife's life." The judge surveyed the courtroom. "Then, it appears we have resolution. This case is dismissed." She banged her gavel one final time. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed around us, shouting questions. Vance stepped forward, his voice steady. My father and I have reconciled our differences. We look forward to Blackwood's Medical's continued success under Westlake's ownership, while the Elise Legacy Foundation carries on my mother's commitment to healing.
A reporter pushed forward. What about Maxwell Reed? Will you be pressing criminal charges? Vance glanced at me, then back to the cameras. Justice will be served, but today is about healing, not vengeance. As the reporters continued shouting questions, Vance and I descended the courthouse steps together. At the bottom, Cassandra waited with Vance's children, my grandchildren, whom I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Grandpa, they called, breaking free from their aunt to run toward me. I knelt to embrace them, feeling their small arms around my neck, their innocent trust a gift I hadn't earned, but would spend the rest of my life honoring. Over their heads, I met Vance's gaze. Something passed between us. Not the easy relationship we'd once had, but something new, something tempered by fire, stronger for having been broken and reforged. Some victories look nothing like you imagined. Sometimes winning means letting go of the very thing you fought to keep. As we walked away from the courthouse, my grandchildren's hands in mine, I thought of Elise. She would have approved of this ending. Not perfect, but real. Not a complete victory, but a true one. Behind us, the reporters continued shouting questions about Maxwell, about the company, about the money. But those weren't the things that mattered anymore. What mattered was walking forward, together, into whatever came next. The most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's redemption. Don't face life's betrayals unprepared. Subscribe now for strategies that save fortunes and families. Still hesitating? Comment ready when you're prepared to protect what's yours.